all the time. Okay, so hand across to Laura, who's going to sort of kick the session off. So thank you, Laura.
Thank you very much. We are going to be trying to access things online as well, so if you need to access the Wi-Fi, if you can just make sure you're connected or you've got data that you can use if you're not on the Wi-Fi, that'd be great. I do have some printed versions of things if people need them as well, just as a bit of a backup. Okay, so as Julie said, I'm Laura Hollinshead. I'm a learning technologist at the University of Derby. Unfortunately, Claire couldn't be with me today, but she's a senior learning technologist at the university, and we've got quite a background of experience in accessibility in particular. Claire is the co-chair of the European user group for the Blackboard product Ally, which I'll explain a little bit more if you don't know about that later on. And she also implemented Ally at the university in our VLE. I'm also a big advocate for accessibility. I've been running workshops at the university for at least 5 years and have developed resources for about 8 years around accessibility as well, which we have readily available. And a really proud moment that we've had recently is that we run a Blackboard Catalyst Award for Inclusive Education, which I just wanted to mention at the beginning because we're really proud of that. It's happened quite recently. Okay, so a bit of an outline for the session. What I'm going to do is just give a bit of a background around accessibility and its importance, but also about some of the work taking place at the university. We're going to have an activity where we're going to think about how we upskill different types of staff. So this is staff in lots of different types of role within the university around accessibility. We'll have a bit of a feedback session from the different groups about key things that you might have found out throughout that activity. Then we're going to think about what we can do to help support upskilling staff that perhaps goes beyond some of the just running sessions and things for staff. And then where we need to go next, and there'll be time for questions at the end. Okay, so in terms of the accessibility regulations, you may or may not be aware, but there are a new set of regulations that came out in September for the public sector bodies to ensure that their websites and mobile apps are all accessible. And this also applies to intranets such as VLEs as well, SharePoint sites, things like that. And the complex thing about this for educational institutions is that these are systems that a wide variety of staff are using across the institution in terms of the types of resources that are being developed and then uploaded and placed onto those systems. So ensuring that they're all accessible is a real challenge for our institutions at this point. But it's important that everybody is aware that they have a role to play in this. It also links to some of the objectives from the Office of Students as well. The Office for Students, sorry. And here it's increasingly important for HE that we look at how accessibility links to their objectives to try and ensure that we have an open and fair access to higher education and that all our students are able to succeed and progress whilst at our institutions. It also links closely to the Attainment Gap, which is another area that the Office for Students is emphasising that institutions need to reduce. And if you look at this statistic, it actually, when you dissect the information further, at the University of Derby, for instance, when you look at part-time disabled students, this attainment gap increases. So it's important that we actually look at these figures closely within our own institutions and consider how we can try and go about reducing this attainment gap. But it goes beyond just our disabled students. This is about all demographics of students and trying to make this as inclusive as possible. And although this accessibility regulations will focus quite closely on the needs of these students in particular, actually making things accessible obviously makes them accessible for everybody or more accessible for everybody as well. So at the University of Derby, we have our university strategies, and a lot of our strategies have inclusive practices embedded within them. Within our institution. We are trying to combine them, so although we've got a TEL strategy, learning and teaching strategy, assessment feedback strategy, and attainment strategy, it goes on and on and on. We are trying to look at combine and condense those together in the future to make it a bit clearer, but inclusive practice and accessibility is a key part of those strategies, so we'll continue to be part of those going forward. We also are embedding it within our curriculum development practices, so we currently have a digital practice baseline, which some people could equate to like a VLE minimum standards, but it sort of goes beyond that because it's not just about the VLE, and accessibility is a key part of that as well, so it's embedded within that in terms of how people need to try and ensure that their practices are inclusive and consider the accessibility of materials that they use. We also deliver some workshops, curriculum development workshops, where we're using advanced HE frameworks, which again, inclusive practice is a key part of those frameworks. So we're trying to emphasise accessibility within that work as well. So for the past 5 years, and actually I've put 5 years, I don't even know how long I've been delivering these workshops within our institution. It could be longer than that. We have been delivering workshops to our academic staff, but that has also involved professional services staff engaging with it around accessibility, trying to encourage people to bring in practices within their everyday work that actually gets them to consider accessibility as part of them developing resources, helping them to think about making their content born accessible so it becomes accessible right from the start whenever they're updating anything, whenever they're creating anything new. We've also got blog posts about it as well and support resources online, which we're continually trying to update and develop to encourage staff to improve their practices around this area. The other thing that we've brought in is Blackboard Ally, and this is actually a product that works across different VLEs, so it's not just Blackboard, although it is part of their product, it actually works in other VLEs. And this helps to provide alternative formats of content. It provides a bit of a kind of rating system, a RAG system about the accessibility of particular content. And then it goes on to provide advice and guidance about how staff can actually improve the accessibility of the content that they have on the VLE. So it talks them through things about what's wrong with it, how they can fix it, the reason they need to fix it. So all the kind of the key parts of them understanding that. For our institution, it's made around a 10% difference in terms of how accessible our content is. So it's improved that about 10%. It also provides institutional reports, so you can actually help to identify issues that might exist in particular courses or modules. And we can then look at our overall rating and how that is progressing over periods of time. So we see this as a key tool for us to be able to monitor the accessibility of content within our VLE. It also helps us to see what sort of the top issues are within our VLE in terms of accessibility. Often it is to do with colour contrast, is one that's quite high. Alternative text on images is one of the highest as well. And again, us knowing that helps us to target resources at staff to try and encourage them to look at those issues and to fix them in the future. Oh, no. It's a tool that is incorporated into the VLE. So it's not a service, but it is something that a lot of people are looking into. So I think Derby was one of the first institutions to just roll it out, and we went radical, and we just went right, and we just rolled it out, and then just waited to see what academic staff thought about it. And we had one member of staff ring up and go, "What's all these red things that are all over my content?" And so we explained it to them, but in fact, the majority of staff didn't actually notice it was there, which is either a good or a bad thing. I'm not really sure, but we've continued to try and raise awareness in the institution of the fact that it's there, what it's there for, the benefits of it being there, so that people don't get concerned about the fact that there's lots of red things all over their content. that actually that's there to help and support them to improve that content and make it better. Okay, so there's 3 key things that we need our staff to think about when they're thinking about accessibility. We need them to understand, why is it important? Why is accessibility? Well, actually, the first thing is, what is accessibility? Because a lot of staff actually consider accessibility to be, it's on the VLE, they have access to it, rather than accessibility in terms of how accessible the content of all of the content is within it for all different types of people. They don't necessarily kind of understand that concept. If you give them the word inclusive, they possibly will understand that more, but because accessibility is often aligned with quite technical things, they often kind of disengage from that and just think it's about making things available. So that's the first thing. But they need to understand why it's important. So they need to understand the law, the accessibility regulations, so understanding the relationship to that. They need to understand about their social responsibility in order to make this content accessible. So it shouldn't just be about sticks, it should be about the fact that they should be doing this anyway as part of their responsibility as educators. But it's also about them taking on individual responsibility for doing this, so that they don't just go, oh, well, we've got Ally, that'll fix things for the students, because actually it doesn't. It doesn't fix everything. It can make things better, but it doesn't make them accessible completely. That's a requirement that is still upon all of the different staff making these resources. They need to understand what the problems are. So they could look at a document and go, that looks fine, it's got headings, I've made them bigger, made them bold, and actually they're not necessarily understanding that there's a fundamental difference between making something bigger and bold to actually assigning it a heading style, which actually helps the computer to then read that as a heading and outline the structure of a document or a presentation, so that people can then access it in a better way. But they also need to then go on to know how to fix the problem. So they need the skills in order to fix them. And again, part of the way that they get to those skills is to understand the why and the what before they can then go on to actually understand the skills that they need themselves. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at working in the groups on your tables to have a bit of a look at different kind of staff personas. So there's a QR code on there, there's a bit.ly link as well to go to a Padlet. I do have some printed versions as well if people need printed versions. And on there you'll find 6 different persona cards for different staff across an institution. And there is also a second, so we've got it here, we've got a second document as well which talks about the common accessibility issues, and these are the ones that have been identified by Ally at our institution, but also noting a few that aren't picked up by Ally, such as the reading order of a PowerPoint slide, or using a consistent readable font. Those sorts of things aren't necessarily going to be picked up by that sort of tool. So hopefully you're all able to get there. Does anybody need printouts? If I have some. I tried to go paperless, but I needed my backup. So in your groups, if you can pick one of the different persona cards that are up there, and just really kind of discuss the persona itself, and then at the bottom of that area there's some key questions that we need to ask in order to be able to support them effectively. Is that okay? Does everybody know what they're doing? Hi everybody. So what I want to do now is I want to get some feedback from the different groups. So if you could finish your conversations, and then we can start and get some key things that you've discussed from the different personas that you've looked at. So hopefully you enjoyed that activity and being able to discuss that with other people. Did anybody look at the learning technologist role at all? Has anybody in the room looked at that? Yeah? So was there anything that, were there any kind of key points that you found from having a look at that particular role and their responsibility in relation to accessibility that you think are important for us to consider?
I guess it's what you said, Laura, is knowing being able to tell, so primarily because we work with academics, so it's knowing the regulations and how to prepare inclusive learning resources so that they can then train and get academics be on board with that. And then we discussed a range of ways in which we can gain or let learning technologies gain the skills, from peer development sessions, websites, lynda.com, bringing in externals like Blackboard Ally to support training, creating workshops is one of the best ways of learning, and then also using Microsoft Accessibility Checker if you don't have Ally.
Great. Okay, over here.
Again, I can say the classic, a lot was said there, thank you very much. But things like the immersive reader within Microsoft Office 365, and as a learning technologist as well, just obviously the onus is on all members of staff for inclusivity and accessibility, but as a learning technologist we need to be at the forefront to kind of support and kind of find these technologies.
Did anybody have a look at the academic role? And again, similar questions, if there was anything particularly that you think is important for them to know about or understand.
So we actually thought that the academic was actually quite an ideal version of an academic, if anything, in that she was already quite aware of what she was doing and obviously tried to make some allowances already. So we thought actually that's quite a bonus that we've already got an engaged academic. Oh, thank you, you wrote stuff down very well. So we talked about the sort of things she might need to know, so things that weren't mentioned. She obviously uses Microsoft Office a lot, but we were saying that perhaps learning how to use alternative formats and styles, particularly knowing about things like using the heading styles in Office and the accessibility checker that's already in Office that she could use. It also mentioned that she knows how to upload content to the VLE, but what it didn't say a lot about was about how she makes that content accessible, so things that she actually creates natively within the VLE rather than things perhaps that she creates in Office. What else? So we were talking about how we could communicate, and we had a bit of a discussion about, you know, is training the best option? Would it just be some guidance, some additional guidance that she could go and look at for herself? Some simulations as well. So Marcus mentioned a Chrome extension called Funkify that allows you to see Chrome with different sort of lenses of disabilities that people might have, which is quite useful. And we were saying that that's a way to get academics to engage in why they should actually care about accessibility, because if you don't have a need yourself, sometimes it's very difficult to sort of see why you should actually make everything that you do accessible. Yes, and we talked about passing information through the sort of central communications to add that gravitas to why people should make things accessible and inclusive in the first place by putting it through as a sort of a university strong push, really.
Great. I think there was another table who looked at it, and I think one of the key things here when we think about academic staff is there's going to be people who haven't engaged and aren't aware, but there are also going to be those people who have engaged but are perhaps overconfident in thinking their content is accessible, when actually things like the Microsoft Office Checker or a product like Blackboard Ally is possibly going to pick up things that they haven't even considered because they're not aware of technical accessibility, which is often something a little bit different. So were there any other points from the other group?
We talked about loads of different areas, but we specifically talked about engagement, and that going to meetings and raising awareness might not just be the only thing that you can do. We talked very much about champions in department to help with the rollout, getting this person trained up as they've got connections with STEM and other things, and people will hopefully listen to a colleague, especially if they've got some case studies and some examples. If she's got that little bit more knowledge, she can spread the word and hopefully encourage others to embrace it, rather than just listening to an IT person going into their department to tell them about it. We also talked about the usefulness of having the list of the common accessibility issues, maybe so people can know what actual issues are about there and how they can deal with those issues. So really it was about upskilling that academic person who already seemed to be aware of it, and trying to get her to spread the word and raise awareness with her colleagues and within departments.
And I think that's a really key point, is that we need advocates out there, because it's not possible for, let's say, the learning technologists or people in IT to actually go out and train all of these people, because there's such a vast quantity of people who are creating these resources. We need the advocates, the people who we can train up, the people who really get it, who can go out there and start championing making this content accessible. Was there anybody who looked at any other roles that would like to share any key points?
We looked at we looked at the IT support person, was it all there? IT advisor. Yep. So I think it took us a while to work out what was what their different requirements would be, but we thought really, we know that it's going to be very difficult to get IT, well in my experience at Goldsmiths, it can be difficult to get, sometimes to get IT sort of service desk staff away from the desk to actually do training. But we thought there was a need to do, we thought online training would give them an overview. That we didn't think they needed all the some of the deep background to the legislation, but they just needed to be clear what it was that they needed to do and look out for. But then with the online training will probably be generic, so then we need to bring them into they would have to be brought into some workshop or meeting just to sort of normalise them. I'm also aware that they often feel they're not actually properly communicated with, so I think it's really important to get them in a room, probably then to go through some of the documents. So I've got your name. Mike, did you talk about the governance points?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that isn't clear on any of these profiles really is exactly what is core, what is a baseline, what is understanding. The amount of people I meet that say I'm wonderful at Excel, but they only know the bits they've ever been taught or ever been shown. So they're very good at the bits they know. So a lot of this is really down to also what are they benchmarking against when people say they're good at something, and how do we actually identify and align with what people believe and what actually is a requirement.
And we also, mentioning governance, recently Goldsmiths, we brought in a quality management system for assessing all our documents, and that's interesting because we're just really focusing on whether it's a clear document, do we agree with the content. The next maturity level is going to be thinking about, is it accessible? Nobody's thinking about that. We're just starting to think that now in the IT department, but that's something that our quality management sort of group could do, but it's yet another aspect, another layer of things they have to think about with the documents. But that will be our sort of governance process.
Great. So there's quite a few key points that I think have come out of the discussions that you've had in your groups. So I hope you've benefited from thinking about that, and that it is about considering all the different people that need to be advocates for this, from student wellbeing to IT trainers. There's all sorts of different people who are involved in this, and it's not just necessarily about thinking about academic staff. it kind of goes beyond that. We're all part of that process. Are there templates that are being created in the university which all academic staff use? But actually, because that template wasn't accessible in the first place, all of this content produced based on that template then becomes something that is actually an issue within an institution. So sometimes getting the people on board who are creating those first is a really key part to trying to make that content accessible. Okay, so we need to think about how we can contribute to this. And this might go beyond thinking about what you can do within your institution and perhaps engaging outside of that with certain communities. So there's a digital accessibility working group, and you can join the JISC mail list for this, and they're kind of concentrating on trying to develop responses to the fact that we've got to get our accessibility statements on a variety of different systems. How do we go about doing that? How are those formatted? What is it that we need to include? How do we work out what to include and how we explain that? So they're focusing on that. They're also focusing on the staff, the development angle of it, in terms of trying to pull together different resources and things. And I know Julie is talking about that later on in the conference as well. So trying to pull together all of those different kinds of accessibility resources so that we can kind of pull everything together, so it's not just us all trying to go off and do the same thing, that we actually work together in order to do it. There is, I don't know how many of you are using the JISC Discovery tool, but if you are, there are a set of accessibility questions being developed through JISC. So again, if you've got the tool within your institution, once those questions, that question sets becomes available, promoting that to staff to actually get them to consider completing that and assessing their accessibility against those sorts of standards may provide a bit of a diagnostic tool which can help point staff in the right direction. It will have similar things like next steps and resources that they can access to upskill themselves in any areas where they don't actually feel particularly confident. And the other aspect of what it is that we do is we need to putting pressure on our suppliers. You know, this isn't just about us doing this. We need to ensure that we push our suppliers to be providing products that are as accessible as possible, have things inbuilt. My suggestion to Microsoft is nobody can add an image unless you add alt text to it. You are forced to do that when you add an image. It's not an option. You know, things like that we need to be pushing back to the people who are creating these products that we're using all the time. Okay, and one of my final thoughts is to think about where next. So in actuality, this isn't just about our staff. This is about our students as well. These are things that our students need to know about. It's about their social responsibility in this as well. These are skills they're going to need when they go out and in the workplace, whether that's because they're having to meet these regulations because they're working for a public sector body, or whether it's because that's the sort of practice they should be taking into any job they go on to do, which involves creating resources and providing online services which should be accessible. We need to start upskilling them and embedding them in the curriculum as well, so that our students can start to take this forward and champion this, and also be embedding that right from the beginning when they start employment and are out there. So I'd like to just finish with any questions you might have or points you might like to raise. Yeah.
Derby, who has led this? I mean, you mentioned a working group, but at Goldsmith, has this come? Our communications department is focusing on this, and now the IT department is focusing on it. I'm not sure in our institution who would be the lead, and then you mentioned a working group, which sounds more sensible. In Derby, who was the lead on this?
So the Digital Accessibility Working Group is actually a wide group, which is encompassing lots of HE and FE institutions who are working together to collaborate. So it's a bit wider than my own institution. At my own institution, it has mainly been the TEL department that have been championing it, because we became aware of this early on before the regulations came in, and trying to push that awareness out into other sectors of the university, other departments, to essentially get them to come on board and realise its importance in relation to their work. And we're only part way through that process. So we are going to be setting up a working group to look at this, to ensure that we're meeting these standards. And again, like the external facing group, that's a collaborative group, it is about those two parts, the statement, so ensuring that you have that ready and is all there available on the different systems, because it's not just the VLE, it's lots of other systems as well. But also that we do consider how we are going to educate our staff. And that's, again, a bigger thing than just the learning technologists going out and delivering sessions to all sorts of different people, because the fact is we don't have the capacity to do that. We need to find those advocates, we need to find those champions out in the different departments in order to drive that forward.
Any more questions or comments? Anyone want to share how they're having things organised within their institutions?
There's too many people in this room to be quiet.
Few more hands now.
Yeah, we've got a couple of hands now.
Don't work my way across.
Hi, it's Alicia from Glyndŵr University. We're doing something similar in that we've got a working group. What we're struggling to do at the moment is get senior management buy-in to this, really. Any tips on that?
Well, to be honest, I think the stick is the best option. Yeah. So I noticed, again, lots of really good information is being shared via this GIS mail list. But something that, Alistair McNaught shared the other day is that actually it isn't about the fines that the regulator is going to slap on you. This is about litigation from disabled students, because that's where your biggest cost is going to come from, because they're going to be aware of these regulations and they're going to start to become more aware of it. And I think sometimes that has a little bit more weight in terms of senior management than other aspects. I would like to think the social responsibility aspect would be a lot higher on their priority list as well. But, sorry, I know you want to say something else. The Office for Students is a key thing in this. Okay. Because it does link back to the Office for Students, it does link back to the Attainment Gap, and they're key things that they want fixed, and accessibility is a part of that.
Just to come back to your point about social responsibility, we've done a couple of workshops and learning lunches and things, and this is probably, it's perhaps a bit similar to what someone else was talking about before, about, is it Funkify, the Chrome extension? But the thing that has most impact on people that they talk to us about afterwards is we get someone from inclusion to come in and show how the assistive technologies work and how frustrating it can be if you've got an inaccessible file. And you can just see it's like a light bulb moment when they're listening to the screen reader going blank, blank.
Yeah.
So that's, if you haven't tried that, that's a good one to try.
Yeah, there's a really good video that we used in our training session, and that's the thing that is possibly one of the most effective things. And it isn't about them trying to use assistive technology, because it's a false thing. They're never, the people who don't need to use that technology will struggle to use it in the first place, and that isn't a true reflection of those people who have to use it and what they experience. Whereas the video that we show, which I think does the same thing as the thing that you're mentioning, when it's reading out HTML links, when it's saying blank, 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 and then you actually point out to them that these are people who are often listening to it at a much quicker rate than the rate that is being read out, that starts to hit home a little bit more. So yeah, that's a really good way of doing that. I think there was somebody else who had a key point to make.
Hi, Wendy Mears at the Open University. I was going to actually say something similar to this lady over here as to how we, the work that we do within the library, we have less direct control over that content because it's subscription external content. So the way that we try to improve the accessibility experience for our students is to work with publishers. We get them in on site, and we allow them to experience as far as possible how a disabled user might attempt to work with their content, and that actually does have a significant impact with their own technical development team. But then we find that they upgrade the platform and they unlearn all the things that they learnt, and then we have to re-educate them again. So they'll do an upgrade and take away all those really good features that they had put in. So it's a never-ending task, but they have proven more. They're proving increasingly willing to work with us on improving that experience.
Yeah, and again, that's a really key point, is that pressure on the suppliers. And this isn't just about, because often allies in our VLE anyway, is picking up a lot of documents that are coming from elsewhere. These are documents that might be not necessarily coming from government, because theirs are quite pared down in terms of accessibility, but it could be coming from the NHS, it could be coming from, a body in education, and actually it's their content that often is being flagged as being inaccessible, and there is nothing that we can do about that unless we go back to them and start saying, we need this content to be accessible. This is a key learning tool for our students. You've supplied it online and made it available, and actually some of our students can't access this. So it's part of our responsibility to start pushing back as well. I know we're having a fight a little bit with some of the public sector bodies that actually help accredit our courses. And again, it's a similar thing. We need to be pushing back on them about practices that they are insisting on, which actually aren't inclusive and are not helpful to a lot of our students. Whether it be because face-to-face is considered better than online learning, and online learning is not considered contact time. This is the sort of stuff that we need to be pushing back on, because we need to be advocating these inclusive practices and say, actually, this isn't about attendance, this is about inclusive practice to ensure that we're delivering this to everybody. Okay, I think we've got a couple of minutes left, but if nobody has any questions, it is lunchtime soon.
Okay, any more comments or questions? Well, I'd like to thank Laura for a really good session, helping us to start thinking about some of the things that we may not have thought about before. We have a few more sessions during the conference to do with accessibility, so if you're keen on that, do look out for those and could have come along. But thank you to Laura, and you can get first in the queue for lunch. Okay, thank you.